Yo, so Trump showing up at this global forum thing wasn't just controversial or whatever. It was straight up weird in a way that went way beyond the usual political drama. What went down wasn't anything like a normal speech, a legit policy argument, or even some calculated troll move. Nah, it felt like dude was low-key falling apart in real time. Thoughts all over the place, jumping from topic to topic, and half the time he'd start saying something and just lose it mid-sentence. The vibe in the room went from, okay, let's see what happens, to what the heck is going on, to people straight up looking uncomfortable, trying to figure out not just what he was saying, but what he was even trying to do. From jump, something felt off. His flow was all jacked up, the words were coming out tangled, and that big confident energy Trump usually brings, gone. Replaced by this weird hesitation and him repeating himself over and over. People who've been watching this dude for years said even his most out there speeches before at least made some kind of sense, even if you hated what he was saying. This time, that structure was just missing. All that was left was bits and pieces of his usual talking points stitched together without any context or making any sense. As he kept going, it got harder and harder to even call it a speech. Like, real speeches go from point A to point B, right? They build up to something. This was just ideas popping up for a sec and then poof, gone. It was like watching someone's brain run faster than their mouth could keep up. It wasn't dramatic in a movie way, it was troubling in a human way. While this whole breakdown was happening live for the world to see, the audience was just as confused. Diplomats and world leaders who are used to political flexing and exaggeration were instead hit with long, awkward pauses, statements that went in circles and references that didn't connect to anything. You could see it on their faces, not like I disagree faces, but more like, yo, is he okay faces? This wasn't about different political views. Everyone was just trying to process what they were watching in real time. Media folks started calling it a collapse real quick, and honestly, that word hit different because it captured how there wasn't really any intention behind the words. Instead of a controversial take people could argue about, viewers saw someone visibly struggling to keep it together. That's a big difference. Criticizing a speech means you're engaging with ideas. A collapse? That's about whether someone can even do the job. What made it extra wild was the setting. This wasn't some rally with his ride or dies or a press conference where he could fight with reporters. This was an international forum where you're supposed to be precise, clear, and diplomatic. Against that backdrop, every stumble hit different, turning personal confusion into a worldwide spectacle. For a lot of people watching, the uncomfortable part was realizing this wasn't just one slip-up or verbal fumble. It went on and on with no recovery. Every minute that passed just reinforced the feeling that the speaker wasn't in control of where this was going, and maybe didn't even know where it was headed. By the time the opening part wrapped up, it was already obvious this moment was going to be picked apart and debated way beyond the event itself, not because of what was said, but because of how much it missed the mark on what people expect from leadership, communication, and keeping it together on the world stage. As the rambling continued, the fallout went beyond just personal embarrassment into actual international relations territory. Statements that seemed to be throwing shade at European leaders came out of nowhere. No context, no clarity, no strategic framing. What might have been read as deliberate provocation before now just sounded unfocused, creating confusion instead of leverage. Diplomacy runs on intention. And here, intention was MIA. European officials listening had no idea what to do. If you clap back hard at unclear statements, you might escalate things for no reason. But if you ignore them, you look like you don't care. This ambiguity left allies feeling some type of way, not sure if they were watching a strategic move or a genuine meltdown. The silence after some of those remarks said everything about how awkward the room was. In the past, Trump beefing with European leaders was usually framed as calculated pressure over trade or defense spending. This time, though, the criticism had no foundation. Without a clear goal, the rhetoric felt empty, leaving allies questioning not just policy direction, but whether they could rely on this guy at all. The uncertainty got worse when Trump seemed to lose track of his own points. References got dropped without explanation, then just abandoned. This pattern killed any attempt to read the speech as strategic. Diplomacy needs consistency, and inconsistency at this level raises major red flags for partners who need predictability. Behind the scenes, analysts started speculating about the bigger picture. If allies can't figure out what the remarks even mean, how are they supposed to plan responses or coordinate positions? The communication breakdown threatened to erode trust, not through hostility, but through pure confusion. That difference matters because confusion weakens alliances in quieter but more lasting ways. International press coverage reflected this concern. Headlines focused less on policy beef and more on the weird tone and delivery. Commentators pointed out that even Trump critics seemed rattled, suggesting this went beyond partisan stuff into institutional stability territory. For European leaders, the challenge was keeping public diplomacy smooth while privately freaking out. Publicly, they had to stay chill to avoid making things worse. Privately, questions were definitely coming up about how to handle future interactions. A partner whose messages you can't understand becomes hard to work with regardless of political alignment. By the end of this section, it was clear the speech had created more questions than answers. Instead of asserting dominance or reshaping alliances, it just introduced uncertainty at a moment when global cooperation is already stressed to the max. Stateside, the reaction was fast and intense. Political commentators across the board struggled to make sense of what they'd seen. Partisan criticism is nothing new, but this response had a different energy, more concerned than outraged. Discussions quickly shifted from policy implications to questions about fitness and responsibility. People started bringing up the 25th Amendment almost immediately. It wasn't framed as a political weapon, but as a legit debate about governance and continuity. The fact that these conversations popped up so fast showed how seriously people took the moment. Lawmakers and analysts emphasized that these discussions weren't happening because of disagreement with ideas, but because of the apparent inability to even articulate ideas. That distinction matters because democratic systems are built to handle ideological conflict, not functional breakdown. When communication falls apart at the highest level, the whole system feels the stress. Media coverage amplified the concern, replaying clips that highlighted the pauses, repetitions, and abrupt topic changes. The cumulative effect painted a picture that was hard to dismiss as a one-time oopsie. Instead, it suggested a pattern that needed scrutiny, regardless of political loyalty. Supporters found themselves in a weird defensive position, different from past controversies. Instead of countering criticism with alternative takes, many struggled to explain what the intended message even was. This lack of a clear defense just fueled more unease. Even allies were like, "I got nothing." Opponents faced their own dilemma. Criticizing the moment too hard risked looking exploitative, while ignoring it risked downplaying a potentially serious issue. The result was a careful tone that acknowledged concern without turning it into a circus. Institutional voices weighed in carefully, emphasizing the importance of stability and clarity in leadership. Former officials and experts framed the conversation around norms and responsibilities rather than personalities, signaling the implications went beyond any single person. As the domestic debate unfolded, it became clear this wasn't just another news cycle controversy. It touched on fundamental questions about leadership, communication, and what we expect from people who hold massive power. One of the wildest moments was when he brought up Greenland, a topic that had been treated as a serious, if controversial, strategic interest before. This time, though, the mention had zero recognition or context, like the subject had just slipped his mind completely. The disconnect was jarring given how big a deal it had been in past discussions. Observers noted this wasn't a case of mispronouncing something or getting a fact wrong. It was apparent unfamiliarity with his own stated priorities. The moment crystallized broader concerns about coherence and continuity. If key issues could come up without any recognition, what did that say about the decision-making happening behind closed doors? The reaction from international audiences was immediate. Greenland, while often the subject of geopolitical analysis, isn't some abstract concept to the people involved. Seeing it referenced so vaguely raised questions about how seriously strategic interests were being treated. Commentators pointed out that leadership is as much about memory and consistency as it is about vision. Revisiting issues requires understanding past positions and commitments. When that understanding appears absent, it tanks confidence in future negotiations. The moment also highlighted the contrast between talk and reality. Ambitious statements from the past now seemed disconnected from the present, creating a sense of fragmentation. This fragmentation erodes the narrative continuity leaders rely on to maintain credibility. For critics, the Greenland reference became a symbol of the broader breakdown. It captured the sense that familiar talking points were being recycled without comprehension. For supporters, it posed an uncomfortable question about whether enthusiasm had outpaced substance. International analysts drew parallels to other moments in history where leader lapses became defining images. Such moments often transcend their immediate context, shaping perceptions long after specific words are forgotten. By the time the reference faded from the conversation, it had already left a lasting impression. Not because of what it contained, but because of what it revealed about the state of the whole discourse. The speech's most head-scratching turn came with an extended focus on windmills, a topic that's shown up over and over in Trump's rhetoric. In the past, these references were framed within energy debates or cultural grievances. This time, the discussion just happened without any clear connection to a bigger argument. What followed felt less like a critique and more like a fixation, looping back on itself without going anywhere. The lack of transition or explanation made it hard to figure out why the topic even came up at that moment. The effect was disorienting, leaving listeners grasping for relevance. Energy policy is a complex and important issue, especially at international forums. Addressing it requires nuance and clarity. The absence of both transformed what could have been a substantive discussion into an example of rhetorical drift. Audience members used to policy-heavy discourse seemed increasingly unsettled. The repetition and lack of resolution suggested the speaker was no longer driving the conversation. The conversation was driving him. This reversal is subtle but significant in public communication. Media analysts later described the segment as symbolic of the broader breakdown. It showed how familiar grievances that were once wielded strategically now surfaced without structure. The difference isn't the topic itself, it's the way it was presented. Critics argued the moment trivialized serious discussions about energy and climate. Supporters countered that the topic had always been controversial, yet both sides struggled to explain the absence of a coherent point, a rare area of agreement. The windmill discussion became a focal point in post-event analysis because it was so visibly disconnected from the setting and audience. International forums demand alignment between message and context. Here, that alignment was missing. As the segment wrapped up, it reinforced the impression that the speech was no longer anchored to any strategic purpose. Instead, it drifted from one familiar phrase to another, leaving behind confusion rather than conviction. In the aftermath, the global reaction came together around a shared sense of unease. This wasn't just about political disagreement or rhetorical style. It was about witnessing a moment that challenged assumptions about leadership and preparedness on the world stage. European leaders responded with careful restraint, choosing their words carefully in public statements. Behind that restraint, though, analysts detected concern about future engagements. Diplomacy runs on clarity, and clarity had been notably absent. Domestically, the conversation kept evolving, shifting from immediate reaction to deeper reflection. Commentators asked whether this moment would be remembered as a one-off or a turning point. The answer remained uncertain, but the question itself showed its significance. The speech's legacy may ultimately lie not in specific quotes, but in the broader conversation it sparked. It forced observers to confront uncomfortable realities about communication capacity and accountability in positions of power. Historical comparisons started emerging as analysts searched for precedents. Such comparisons are rarely flattering, and they underscore how moments of visible breakdown can reshape public perception more powerfully than policy outcomes. For supporters and critics alike, the challenge was reconciling loyalty or opposition with what had been plainly observed. That reconciliation process is often harder than partisan debate because it demands honesty over rhetoric. Internationally, the event served as a reminder that global leadership is as much about presentation as it is about power. Words spoken on these stages carry weight, not just for their content, but for what they reveal about the speaker. As the dust settled, one conclusion was unavoidable. What went down wasn't just a bad speech. It was a moment that exposed vulnerabilities rarely seen so openly, leaving a lasting mark on political discourse at home and abroad. Trump's long-running beef with windmills came back again, but this time it felt less like a political position and more like a personal grudge spiraling out in public. The fixation had a Don Quixote-type quality, a battle against imagined enemies that exist not as policy challenges, but as aesthetic annoyances. His complaints seemed rooted not in energy policy or environmental impact, but in how wind turbines mess with the visual perfection of his golf courses, reinforcing the idea that personal vanity continues to outweigh public responsibility. This obsession struck many observers as extra ironic, given Trump's own history of flashy but often criticized design choices. From gold-heavy interiors to over-the-top branding, his aesthetic taste has long been polarizing. Against that backdrop, claiming windmills somehow degrade beauty felt hollow, like the argument itself mattered less than asserting control over the landscape. The way Trump kept returning to this topic suggested fixation rather than strategy. Instead of putting wind energy in a broader economic or geopolitical context, he circled the same grievances, reinforcing the perception that the issue exists mainly as a personal offense. This inward focus drained the discussion of relevance, turning a global issue into a narrow expression of self-interest. Audience reactions reflected growing discomfort. What might once have been dismissed as eccentric rhetoric now carried different weight, as repetition without progression signaled something deeper than stubbornness. The absence of new points or expanded reasoning made the fixation feel compulsive rather than deliberate. Critics noted that leadership requires the ability to prioritize issues proportionally. When cosmetic concerns dominate discourse at the expense of substantive challenges, it raises questions about judgment. In this case, the windmill obsession overshadowed way more pressing global matters, amplifying concerns about misplaced focus. The tone of these remarks also lacked the performative confidence that once defined Trump's style. Instead of sharp attacks or calculated provocations, the delivery felt strained, like the argument itself was slipping away even as it was being repeated. This moment reinforced a broader pattern emerging from recent appearances. Familiar grievances surface again and again, but without the clarity or force that once made them politically effective. What remains is repetition stripped of persuasion. By the end of this segment, the windmill obsession no longer seemed symbolic of ideological resistance. Instead, it felt emblematic of a narrowing worldview where personal discomfort gets elevated to national concern. Alongside the windmill fixation came renewed scrutiny of Trump's physical presentation, which many viewers found concerning. His facial expressions appeared uneven, his posture slumped, and his movements lacked the sharpness once associated with his public persona. These visual cues intensified speculation, not as partisan attack, but as observational concern grounded in what audiences could plainly see. Commentators emphasize that such observations are unavoidable in public life. When leaders appear on global stages, every detail gets magnified, and visible changes naturally invite interpretation. In this case, the changes were stark enough that even longtime observers struggled to dismiss them. The drooping appearance of his face became a focal point, prompting comparisons that extended beyond politics into health-related speculation. While no formal diagnoses were offered, the persistence of these visual cues made them hard to ignore. The discussion shifted from rhetoric to physiology, an uncomfortable but unavoidable transition. Making things worse were reports of bruising on his hands, visible in multiple appearances. Though such marks can have harmless explanations, their recurrence added another layer to the growing narrative of physical decline. In public discourse, patterns matter, and this pattern fueled unease. Speech analysts also pointed to increasing instances of slurring and mispronunciation. These weren't isolated slips, they were recurring features that disrupted understanding. When communication itself becomes strained, the impact goes beyond style into substance. Supporters tried to frame these moments as fatigue or stress, but the cumulative effect proved hard to neutralize. Each new appearance reinforced earlier impressions, creating a feedback loop of concern that kept growing. Media coverage reflected this shift, adopting a more careful tone that balanced respect with scrutiny. Rather than mocking, many outlets framed their analysis around responsibility and transparency, signaling that the issue had moved beyond partisan spectacle. As these observations piled up, they formed a backdrop against which every statement was evaluated. Words no longer stood alone. They were filtered through visible signs of strain that changed how audiences interpreted intent and capability. The discussion increasingly turned toward cognitive decline, a topic once considered off-limits but now openly debated due to repeated public indicators. Memory lapses, fragmented sentences, and abrupt topic shifts combined to create a pattern that viewers couldn't easily dismiss. This wasn't about isolated mistakes, it was about consistency over time. Observers noted that Trump often seemed to lose his place mid-thought, restarting sentences or just abandoning them entirely. Such moments disrupted narrative flow and undermined any attempt at sustained argument. Communication at its core relies on continuity, and continuity was frequently missing. The strain was visible not just in content, but in effort. At times, he seemed to wrestle with words as though searching for expressions that once came naturally. This struggle changed the energy of his delivery, replacing dominance with tension. Psychological analysts cautioned against armchair diagnosis while acknowledging that patterns deserve attention. The emphasis stayed on observable behavior rather than speculation, grounding the discussion in what audiences could directly witness. What unsettled many viewers was the apparent lack of awareness. Rather than recognizing moments of confusion and adjusting, Trump often pressed forward, making the disarray worse with further digressions. This inability to self-correct intensified concerns about judgment. Political allies found themselves in an increasingly tough spot. Defending policy positions is one thing. Defending coherence is another. As explanations got thinner, silence became more common, signaling discomfort rather than confidence. Opponents, meanwhile, struggled to balance critique with restraint. Exploiting perceived decline risks ethical backlash, yet ignoring it risks neglecting legitimate public interest. The result was a careful, often somber tone across much of the commentary. By this point, the conversation had clearly shifted. It was no longer centered on ideology or ambition, but on capacity, awareness, and whether leadership under visible strain could be sustained.